The morning of February 12, 1988, unfolded over the Black Sea with a cold stillness that belied the tension gathering just below the horizon. For the Soviet Navy, this body of water was not simply geography. It was a guarded threshold, a strategic enclosure they believed no adversary would dare enter without consequences. Since the 1970s, Moscow had treated the region as a de facto internal zone, reinforced by dense coastal radar coverage, layered air defenses, and a fleet posture designed to discourage even the slightest intrusion by NATO vessels. Yet on that morning, Soviet watch officers across the Black Sea Fleet Command began noticing something unusual. Two American warships, moving deliberately and without deviation, were closing in on the 12-mile territorial boundary. The radar signatures matched vessels the Soviets knew well: the Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser USS Yorktown and the Spruance-class destroyer USS Karen. Both ships had participated in prior freedom of navigation operations, but never this deep, never this boldly, and never with such calculated disregard for the geopolitical sensitivities of the region. Inside the Soviet command centers, analysts understood the implications instantly. The Black Sea was heavily monitored. Nothing entered undetected. But this was different. The Americans weren't probing, weren't shadowing, weren't executing a routine presence mission. They were heading straight toward Soviet-claimed waters in a maneuver the U.S. had long argued was consistent with international maritime law, innocent passage, while the USSR rejected that interpretation entirely for the Black Sea. The closer the American vessels came, the more uneasy the Soviet officers grew. They knew what the official doctrine demanded: prevent violations of territorial integrity without triggering a conflict. But enforcing that rule against a heavily armed U.S. cruiser was far more complicated than the manual suggested. The Soviet fleet could shadow, could warn, could intimidate, but could not fire first. And as the radar tracks marched steadily toward the boundary line, it became clear that the Americans understood this limitation perfectly. The situation escalated not through noise or chaos, but through the silent certainty of two ships refusing to alter course. A certainty that would push the confrontation toward consequences no Soviet admiral expected. As the American warships closed the final miles toward the 12-mile limit, Soviet coastal command posts heightened their alert levels. In Crimea, radar stations began shifting from routine tracking to heightened scrutiny, feeding updated plots to the Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol. Officers there had seen close encounters before, but nothing about this approach fit the usual patterns. The Americans weren't weaving, weren't broadcasting distress, and weren't conducting surveillance or evasive maneuvers. Instead, they advanced with steady propulsion, maintaining a formation that suggested confidence rather than caution. On the Soviet side, the responsibility for direct interception fell to two patrol vessels, the frigate Bezavitny and the smaller SKR-6. Both ships were experienced in escort and harassment duties, trained to pressure foreign vessels without escalating into active hostilities. Their commanders understood the task: force the intruders to change course, demonstrate resolve, and obey standing orders, but remain strictly within the boundaries of non-lethal contact. In doctrine, this balance seemed manageable. In practice, confronting a modern U.S. cruiser presented a challenge the Soviet manuals didn't fully address. The USS Yorktown in particular complicated matters. As a Ticonderoga-class vessel equipped with the Aegis combat system, it represented a leap in naval warfare technology. Soviet analysts had studied its capabilities, understood its advanced radar arrays, and recognized that its threat detection speed far surpassed that of any ship in the Black Sea Fleet. Even so, none of that technology explained why the Americans were deliberately placing themselves inches from a political and military crisis. As the Yorktown and Karen crossed into waters the USSR considered sovereign, alarms sounded across the Soviet intercept vessels. The moment had shifted from speculation to confrontation. The Soviet commanders issued warnings over open channels, closely adhering to the language required by protocol. They followed the script: assert the territorial claim, demand withdrawal, and signal readiness to enforce the boundary. But what they expected next, hesitation, negotiation, or at least a visible reduction in speed, never came. Instead, the American ships continued forward with an almost unnerving indifference, as if operating on a timetable independent of the escalating tension around them. And it was this absolute steadiness, more than the ships themselves, that began to rattle Soviet officers who understood how volatile the next decisions could be. For the Soviet officers aboard Bazavatny, the moment the Americans refused to alter course marked a shift from controlled enforcement to a test of resolve none of them had anticipated. The Soviet Navy had long operated under a doctrine shaped by rigid hierarchy and strict operational boundaries. Initiative was discouraged. Predictability was expected. But now they faced an opponent who appeared to understand those constraints better than the Soviets themselves. The Americans were not just intruding, they were maneuvering inside the psychological framework of Soviet command. As Bazavatny accelerated to close the gap, its crew braced for the delicate task they had rehearsed but seldom executed in real conditions. The shouldering maneuver, physically nudging a foreign ship to compel a change of course without the use of weapons. In theory, this tactic allowed the USSR to defend its territorial claim without firing a shot. In reality, it required precision, judgment, and a willingness to accept significant risk. The massive displacement difference between the Soviet frigate and the American cruiser made the maneuver inherently dangerous. On the bridge of the Yorktown, the situation was viewed through an entirely different lens. The United States had invoked the principle of innocent passage, asserting what it considered a universally recognized maritime right. In their perspective, altering course would have validated the Soviet territorial claim. Maintaining course, therefore, was not an act of provocation but an assertion of legal consistency, reinforced by the confidence that the Soviets, bound by political caution, would not escalate to lethal force. This asymmetry of doctrine became the core of the unfolding confrontation. Where the Soviets saw a threat requiring active interception, the Americans saw a legal exercise requiring calm persistence. And as Bazavatny drew dangerously close to the Yorktown's port side, the gap between these interpretations narrowed to less than a ship's length, a margin where physics, not diplomacy, would determine the outcome. The Soviet commander now faced a rapidly shrinking set of choices, each carrying the potential for international crisis. And with every second that the American cruiser held its course, the pressure on the Soviet crew intensified, pushing them toward a decision that no naval manual could fully explain or justify. When the hull of the Soviet frigate finally made contact with the Yorktown, it was not a sudden collision but a grinding, forceful shove, the kind of maneuver that skirted the edge of naval confrontation while technically remaining below the threshold of armed conflict. Steel scraped against steel as Bazavatny angled its bow into the American cruiser's port side, attempting to physically force the larger ship off course. Sparks scattered across the gray surface of the sea, and the jolt reverberated through both vessels. Yet despite the impact, the American cruiser neither halted nor deviated. Damage control teams acted immediately, but there was no sign of panic on deck. To the Soviet crew, this reaction, or lack thereof, was deeply unsettling. The collision was supposed to intimidate, to compel, to break the American formation. Instead, it revealed a level of preparedness that suggested the Americans had anticipated such an encounter well before entering the Black Sea. As the two ships churned through the water, locked momentarily in a contest of momentum and mass, Soviet analysts monitoring from Sevastopol struggled to interpret what they were witnessing. Soviet naval doctrine assumed that physical aggression would force an adversary to disengage. But the Americans appeared to treat the ramming as a procedural inconvenience, not an act of escalation. The distinction mattered. To the Soviets, this was a breach demanding resolution. To the Americans, it was merely another variable in a pre-calculated mission. Behind the scenes, a deeper strategic layer was unfolding. The Soviet coastal defense network surged with activity, radar stations, communication nodes, and air defense units all reacting to the intrusion. Every transmission, every radar sweep, and every alert generated an electronic signature. What was unknown to the Soviet officers at that moment was that the Yorktown, with its highly advanced Aegis combat system, was silently collecting this data in real time. Thus, while the Soviet frigate believed it was asserting control through physical force, the Americans saw the encounter as dual purpose. A legal demonstration of navigational rights and a rare opportunity to gather valuable intelligence on Soviet electronic behavior. And this divergence, physical confrontation versus informational advantage, defined the true imbalance between the two sides as the confrontation continued. As the Yorktown steadied itself after the impact, the full extent of the asymmetry between the two navies became increasingly visible. While the Soviet crews were shaken by the physical consequences of the maneuver they had initiated, the American formation remained intact and composed. The Karen, following astern, maintained its course with equal discipline. It too would soon endure aggressive contact from the smaller Soviet patrol vessel SKR-6, another attempt to force a diversion that achieved little beyond adding to the growing uncertainty inside the Soviet command structure. In Sevastopol, admirals monitored the situation with an intensity bordering on disbelief. Soviet expectations had long been shaped by the assumption that Western vessels would avoid serious confrontation, especially in closed waters so close to Soviet air and missile coverage. But unlike previous encounters, the Americans were not behaving as a navy under pressure. They were behaving as a navy executing a mission designed with full awareness of Soviet thresholds. Their confidence, to Soviet commanders, appeared almost reckless, until later analysis revealed it was anything but. The Soviet leadership had anticipated that the psychological weight of potential escalation would be enough to deter foreign ships from entering the Black Sea's contested zones. Yet here was a U.S. cruiser, bearing the scars of a deliberate collision, proceeding deeper into waters the Kremlin considered inviolable. It was not the physical damage that unsettled Soviet officers. It was the message embedded in the act of persistence. The Americans were demonstrating that territorial claims not recognized under international law could not be enforced by intimidation alone. Meanwhile, the Aegis system aboard the Yorktown continued its silent work. As Soviet coastal radars surged in response to the confrontation, each frequency shift and command relay became part of a growing electronic picture. The Americans were not only upholding navigational principles, they were gathering a near-live map of the Soviet Black Sea command and control network, reaction times, radar signatures, air defense activation patterns. What the Soviets perceived as controlled defensive mobilization, the Americans saw as a valuable, unguarded exposure. And as the two U.S. vessels maintained their steady heading, it became increasingly clear that the real confrontation was not occurring along the ships' hulls but within the competing doctrines guiding each navy. Doctrines that would determine the lasting meaning of this encounter. In the days that followed the incident, the Soviet Navy initiated a series of internal reviews intended to explain why their intercept operation had failed to achieve its intended effect. What began as a technical assessment quickly evolved into a deeper institutional reckoning. Interrogations, radar playback sessions, and tactical debriefings all pointed toward the same unsettling conclusion. The Americans had demonstrated not a momentary act of boldness, but a structural advantage the Soviet fleet had not fully appreciated. The ramming had revealed nothing about American vulnerability, but everything about Soviet constraints. Their ships had acted with physical force, yet achieved no strategic gain. The Yorktown and Karen had kept their course, completed their transit, and departed the Black Sea without a single deviation. And while the Soviets evaluated hull damage and procedural adherence, the Americans returned home with something far more valuable: a detailed understanding of how the entire Black Sea defense network reacted under pressure. For the Soviet admirals reviewing the final reports, the implications were clear. The encounter had exposed a divergence that extended far beyond two ships scraping paint in contested waters. It revealed a contrast between a system built on rigid control and one designed around initiative, precision, and information dominance. The episode did not change the map of the Black Sea, but it altered the perception of balance within it. And in the final years of the Cold War, perception, as much as firepower, shaped the course of history.